Thank you for watching. Remember Mrs. Smith? She was hospitalized for approximately 24 hours before experiencing symptoms of alcohol withdrawal. It has now been nearly 34 hours since her admission to the hospital. Throughout this time, Mrs. Smith has continued to experience visual hallucinations and has remained anxious and agitated. The only new symptom that has emerged in Mrs. Smith's condition is the feeling of bugs crawling all over her skin. This phenomenon is known as tactile hallucination, where individuals perceive tactile sensations without external stimuli. Mrs. Smith's husband is by her bedside, displaying support and concern for her well-being. He has been sharing a series of troubling events with Mrs. Smith's healthcare team, including a DUI incident, multiple falls, and a noticeable decline in her social life and self-care. Just 5 minutes ago, Mrs. Smith repeatedly told her husband something was wrong with her. He promptly informed the healthcare team, and the nurse immediately attended to her. When asked about her condition, Mrs. Smith replied, "I am experiencing something I have never felt before. I would appreciate it if you could explain that to me, please." However, before she answered, Mrs. Smith suddenly stiffened and began moaning loudly. The nurse promptly placed her on oxygen, put seizure pads on her bedside rails, and called for additional assistance from a colleague at the nearby nurse station. Mrs. Smith started having seizures at 10:35 and requested 1 milligram of Ativan before calling the doctor. Mrs. Smith's stiffness was then replaced by rapid jerking movements in her arms and legs. The nurse administered Ativan through her IV to help alleviate the intensity of the jerking activity. After approximately 125 seconds from the onset of the seizure, the activity finally subsided. However, Mrs. Smith started biting her tongue and experiencing involuntary urine release. The nurse immediately repositioned Mrs. Smith on her side and suctioned away excessive saliva and blood caused by the tongue bite. Upon the doctor's arrival in the room, the nurse briefed him on the sequence of events. Mrs. Smith had experienced a relentless bout of seizures starting at 10:35, which persisted for approximately 2 minutes before subsiding. She is currently receiving oxygen and was given 1 milligram of Ativan. Aside from biting her tongue, there were no other injuries. At present, Mrs. Smith is unresponsive and flaccid. The doctor acknowledged this as the postictal phase and instructed the nurse to protect her airway and obtain vital signs. Additionally, the doctor mentioned ordering a phenobarbital and arranging for Mrs. Smith's transfer to another unit that provides a higher level of care. As the doctor was about to leave the room, he noticed Mrs. Smith's husband standing motionless in the corner, his eyes filled with a haunting emptiness. Realizing the need for compassion and support, the doctor approached Mr. Smith and took a few precious minutes to converse, offer reassurance, and answer his questions before departing. Mrs. Smith was unresponsive in the postictal phase, which refers to the period that follows a seizure at the time of her transfer to another unit. During this phase, individuals may experience various symptoms such as confusion, exhaustion, headache, muscle aches, and general discomfort. It is a recovery period for the brain and body after the seizure activity has subsided. The duration of the postictal phase can vary from person to person, ranging from minutes to hours. During this time, it is essential to provide support, monitor the individual, and ensure their safety until they fully recover. Thank you for returning to check on Mrs. Smith. I appreciate your consistent support and hope to see you regularly on my channel.